Welcome back to the Sipping with Savage podcast. It's me, Savage, and today we're doing something a little different, a little the same. We are reading today "This Is Not a Test" by my very good friend, Jose Luis Vilson. I do have their permission to be recording this. There was certainly a need. It has been scientifically proven that staying hydrated helps your brain work, and I find that reading can be at times very taxing on the brain. So grab a drink. I'm just drinking some water. You'll probably hear it. It's not the most subtle bottle. Shout out to Corksicle for this travel canteen. And let's get started. To the beloved red light and the little defender and warrior. Forward. In today's heated environment, where school reform is at the center of controversy, teachers have cried out for a voice. The decisions that are made far from our classrooms have a tremendous, often deleterious impact on our students, and teachers see the damage up close and personal. As a result, voices from across the country have surfaced to decry the insensitive, painful consequences of the test and punish movement. Out of this cacophony rises a beautiful, lyrical voice, one that is uncompromisingly self-aware, reflective, and analytical. That transcendent voice belongs to the Jose Luis Vilson. I became aware of JLV late one night after someone provided a link to his blog. I was taken by the truth, the vulnerability, and the clarity of his writing. It was clear that this man, and there are so few men in the profession, let alone men of color, had a passion for educating children of color. This passion fuels a constant search to make education relevant no matter what. He is a math teacher who can develop his students in the glow of hip-hop while explaining the quadratic formula. As a role model for Black and Latino males, Jose takes seriously the responsibility placed on his shoulders. There are 1,000 education books you can read, but I think you should read This Is Not a Test because of the way Jose approaches his circuitous journey of becoming a teacher. We get a glimpse of his early life, complicated yet loving, replete with teachers who made an impact on his life. His neighborhood, his walk to school, and his time inside the Catholic school classroom are so vividly painted that the words jump off the page as his voice keeps ringing like the school bell calling the children to class. It is rare that a man this young can demonstrate the wisdom of the ages. He's ready to talk about what it means to be confident when one is supposed to feel shame. He's got stories about his parents, the Dominican mom and the Haitian dad. But his best work comes when he interrogates his own behavior, motives, needs, and desires. It has been my experience that when It has been my experience It has been my experience that when conversations about race and class come up, folks run to their respective identity corners. The iniquity of slavery, Jim Crow, and now the new Jim Crow has many folks defensive. I didn't own slaves. Somewhere in Jose's narrative, he finds a way to say, but if you benefit from the consequences of slavery, then. He asks hard questions while seeking a way to find solutions, yet he's not afraid to admit when something doesn't work. And while he doesn't shy away from class, this Afro-Latino brother is pure class. Jose's dalliance with Teach for America TFA and his ability to reflect and synthesize the lessons he has learned from that experience are insightful, as is his keen take on how organizations like TFA, Democrats for Education Reform, and the rest use statistics and numbers to promote vicious policies. Jose debunks that approach with a quick turn of phrase. People have grown to equate a number with a fact. No matter what else you read this year, read this. This Is Not a Test is a book that screams against the vagaries of a kind of school reform that ignores the voices of the adults and children who work in public schools. He says, our jobs discourage vocalizing dissent, both through individual administrators, intimidation tactics, and through formal internet policies. The hours teachers spend in class and on paperwork also leave little energy for advocacy or political action. But political activity is what it will take to throw off the shackles of oppressive mandates imposed by folks who do not place their own children in test and punish institutions. What Jose really advocates for is a fundamental redistribution of power, from a top-down approach to one in which teachers, collectively and individually, take ownership of their roles in reforming education, something our current set of reformers don't all believe is necessary. There it is again, that insistence upon teacher voice. It's neither whine nor bellow, but a steady trumpeting that resonates with us all. Those those of who do the work, those of who do the work, have compassion for our students and know the strengths and limitations of our institutions must have a voice. I await the next book that will explode across the page from Jose's pen. Karen Lewis, President, Chicago Teachers Union. On perspective and introduction. Those children should find soft lives that drop pendulums in their dreams and never tell another story about the ghetto until they've had to count rats with their hands. Tara Betts, for those who need a true story. On the surface, you might assume Tara Betts is telling a story about a kid who, at his mother's behest, kills as many rats as possible so the landlord will lower their rent. Such a tale hits at my very core. I live a little better now, but when my family lived on Clinton Street on the Lower East Side of Manhattan, back when no one wanted to live there, rats came as naturally as breathing and phases of the moon. While the synagogue still called people to worship on Norfolk Street, and Cat's Delicatessen became a cultural relic of an older Lower East Side, the 1990s version of the LES had every bit of the street cred that Bedford-Stuyvesant and Harlem did on rap records, without the actual rappers. Roaches scraped crumbs off the floor Roaches scraped crumbs off the floor like poor folks did. Killing them symbolized an urban food chain. When I was maybe 4 or 5, I walked into the bathroom and saw a rat in my tub. I had no experience with killing rats whatsoever, although I'd smelled the faint scent of rat blood, pungent and acidulous, and heard rats pitter-patter behind my walls and under my bed. I tried to wash this gray pup into the drain so it'd scurry like the roaches do, but it stood its ground. This soaked little creature stood there, no bigger than an inch, petrified and shivering, eyes glistening and claws close to its side. I stared at it, then spoke to it for a few minutes. I thought I could befriend it, but the wiser part of me retracted my finger before I could risk catching anything that would make me shiver too. So we just stayed there, me leaning against the porcelain-coated tub, the rat standing within an inch of an indeterminate sinkhole of escape or death, both of us pondering whether we'd break out of our natural inclination to defend or offend each other's species. Eventually, I called my mom. She ushered me out of the bathroom, told me everything would be okay, and walked back into that bathroom with a sigh. A few minutes later, she came back out and said the rat was quote-unquote gone. I'm not sure what actually happened to it, but I know I never saw it again. To this day, I'm still too nervous to ask her. The parallels between the lives of kids in impoverished neighborhoods and those of rats do not escape me. They help explain why I write as I do. Those who have lived similar experiences to mine understand why we keep a guarded demeanor even when expressing our deepest emotions. We have an unsettling rage beneath our otherwise calm exteriors. Simply walking down the street has been an exercise in survival, even for those of us who consider ourselves nerds or outcasts. The street has taught us not to snitch, not because we want to protect the offenders, but because the deaths of people like Amadou Diallo show that even our supposed protectors have something against us. So we speak in folklore, rhyme, and bombast. Tired of waiting for a chance to be heard, many of us have created our own spaces, lest we too get washed down the sinkhole. I've carried this mentality since doubt became part of my early existence. Before I had the inclination to suck my thumb or walk my first steps, doubt slept under my bed with the monsters and shadows. Many of my family members doubted whether I should have ever even been conceived, since I was born of a Haitian man and a Dominican woman. This doubt has fol- this doubt was followed by the tension of being raised in my very early years by a single mother who pushed me harder than she pushed herself through the plethora of jobs she took to keep herself employed. She eventually filed for disability at a relatively young age. When my stepfather entered the picture, his old school child rearing mentality led to many irrational beatings and punishment modeled along what we see in Latino internet memes, like kneeling on rice with my arms out for making too much noise. Outside our home, even if our mothers never ingested cocaine in the 70s and 80s, kids from my generation born into similar circumstances knew that high society widely doubted our survival and didn't care to see how our own government was complicit in our vulnerability. I knew underestimation before I could even spell the word. Only confidence, bordering on cockiness, would serve as the antidote. An amorphous doubt has also showed in people's reactions to me throughout my life, many of whom you'll meet in the following pages. Teachers expected shame, but I beamed confidence. Administrators expected fear, but I showed bravery. District officials expected quiet, but I spoke up. Others expected tears, but I refused to shed them. I remember one incident in the summer of 1996 when, as part of a summer camp program, my 8th grade diploma newly minted, I had to attend a class on creative writing. I found the class silly, but I didn't want to ruin my momentum by dissenting over something so minor. The teacher gave us a homework assignment: pick a number and write a poem about it. I struggled for an hour trying to come up with a way to describe the number 3, but all I kept hearing was Blind Melon's cover of 3 is the Magic Number, a Schoolhouse Rock song I could not push out of my cranium for even a second. Perhaps the summer air wouldn't let me concentrate, or perhaps I simply wanted a way out of this assignment. But the next day, when the teacher put his hand out for my assignment, I mumbled, I didn't do it. Another student had used the number 8's shape as a metaphor for pieces of his life. When the teacher turned back to me, he said, Jose, the thing with you is, you're smart and everything, but you're just naturally lazy. My eyes fell out of my head. I wanted to cry or stuff my face with a grilled cheese sandwich. Lazy? How was that even possible? All the plaudits, awards, and well wishes of my teachers only a month before didn't count in this person's eyes. His judgment came down like a hammer when a simple tap would have sufficed. It made me doubt my own writing ability. Looking back, doubt had come in my inability to look at a number abstractly, to consider its shape rather than its value. As I grew older, my identity as a Black Latino man only made things more complicated. When my mother moved from the Dominican Republic to Miami in the 1970s, she was a young girl trying to please her tough love father. She met my Haitian father working at the same hotel as he did. I would be his only Dominican child, out of the 7 children he would eventually have with different mothers. My parents didn't stay together long. My mother moved to the Lower East Side of New York, and my father moved to Flatbush in Brooklyn. My mother thought it gracious to let me see. Hold on. My father thought. No, hold on. My mother thought it gracious to let my father see me, which he did on a yearly basis. But I couldn't capture her grace, her capacity to make people feel welcome, or his charisma, his ability to get people to gravitate toward him. Miscegenation is in this country's fiber. People fight so hard for the right to love each other regardless of background. Yet I never found solace identifying as Dominican or Haitian. The residue of years of battle between Haiti and the Dominican Republic trickled down to my families too. As dark skinned as my Dominican family is, longtime dictator Rafael Trujillo, architect of the Dominican Republic's racial constructs, taught them to see themselves as European. Hold on. Architect of the Dominican Republic's racial constructs taught them to see themselves as European as possible. The darkest Dominicans identify with the Tainos, the indigenous people of the Dominican Republic. Anyone who acknowledged their blackness must have wanted to be Haitian, a serious threat to Dominican nationalism. My Haitian family, having understood this dynamic from the other side of the island, sometimes perceived my distance as snootiness, as if I was looking down at them instead of looking down at my feet. Living with my mother made me take on more of the Dominican culture, even though a part of me still wishes I could speak Creole. I swung and spun with the best of the Dominicans on the dance floor, but my facial features didn't resemble other Dominicans they thought they knew. Not even the ones who came from predominantly Afro Latino Santo Domingo. I visited my Haitian grandmother's house in Brooklyn and couldn't understand a bit of Creole and had trouble digesting the spices in my grandmother's rice, at least at first. I didn't understand why my brothers, sisters, and cousins on that side couldn't fully accept me, despite looking so much like me. I have visited the Dominican Republic 6 times in my lifetime, always thinking I'd find parts of my mother's culture that could make me whole. But I encountered ridicule instead. I learned how to seethe. I learned how to seethe when a child asked 8-year-old me in front of his friends what muela was, and I couldn't remember offhand. When he revealed that it was a molar, the children ran, jumped, and laughed inappropriately hard. The adults fed me pity in tablespoons when I tried to express myself past tengo hambre, I'm hungry. Imagine if I stepped into Port-au-Prince, Haiti, without a timbre of Creole in my voice. I never did, and haven't yet. I would have preferred to set up shop right on the banks of the rivers that split the Dominican Republic and Haiti, countries squabbling politically, but at war culturally. I started to set up camp in this hypothetical river when I determined that my skin color should not affect my citizenship to the world around me. My writing works in the same vein. I've been told that in order for my writing to be universal, it must turn away from things like race or nationality or the conditions of my upbringing. As much as people like the exotic and the erratic on a superficial level, it is even more important to be able to exert order, to be able to categorize those who speak in distinctive voices, to pat them on the head or ignore them completely. I can't allow that. Too many others have felt as I felt, have seen what I saw, have wanted their personhood recognized and their rats counted. What you're about to read is the most honest account of my life up until this point, and how my sense of self has influenced my identity as an educator. As a teacher, I have found that bringing my experiences into my teaching makes the lessons more profound. A connection implicitly highlighted in Paulo Freire's Pedagogy of the Oppressed. Freire uses terms Sorry, had to unexpectedly stop for just a moment. I will pick up in that sentence that I was in. As a teacher, I have found that bringing my experiences into my teaching makes the lessons more profound. A connection implicitly highlighted in Paulo Freire's Pedagogy of the Oppressed. Freire uses terms student-teacher and teacher-student, asking us all to think about the cyclical nature of our teaching and learning. Just by living our lives as we do, we become teachers of those experiences. In this book, I have chosen honesty over concession, not to launch personal attacks, but to provide opportunities for understanding, to fill the holes. As the rapper Immortal Technique once said, there's usually nothing wrong with compromise in a situation, but compromising yourself in a situation is another story completely. At some point, I saw the little boat I'd been given to row, looked at its bleak destination, and decided I didn't want to end up there. Father Jack Podsiadlo, hopefully I said that correctly, my longtime mentor and a father figure to hundreds of students at Nativity Mission School, used to read us the story of Jesus walking on water. In it, the disciples had gone out on a boat at Jesus' behest to come see him. He appeared to them some time later and walked on the lake to meet them. They were obviously terrified, but Jesus reassured them to take the walk with him. Peter, the most eager, went out to walk first and started to follow in Jesus' footsteps. However, he let doubt creep into him and soon fell right into the lake. When Peter yelled out, "Jesus, save me," Jesus came and helped him back on the boat, but not before asking him why he didn't believe in him. I took a different meaning from it than perhaps even what Father Jack meant to deliver in his homily. When we find our passions, we must enter into them boldly and trust that we do what we do with a love for that. Right now, and possibly forever, those passions include teaching and writing. And here's my testament to it. I had to get off the boat so I could walk on water. What is this test about, mister? Well, it looks to me like it's the math predictive assessment today. So it's a math test. Oh my God, another one. Yes, another one. The class in proctoring collectively rolls their eyes counterclockwise. What for? Well, this one is to see how much you've learned about math up to this point. The school and your teachers use it to see what you need to learn from here to the actual test. Oh. On January 18th, 2013, I had just returned from a 9-day paternity leave. A snowless patch of time I relished with my fiance, Luce, and our newborn son, Alejandro Luis, who had been delivered at St. Luke's Roosevelt Hospital on the west side of Manhattan. Secretly, Luce had hoped Alejandro and Blue Ivy Carter would share space there. They were born just a couple of days apart. The little nugget and I had shared tender and intimate moments over those days. The first time I changed his diaper, he peed all over my fossil watch. The first time he smiled at me, he followed it with an explosive fart that woke Luce up from her nap. The first football game he watched, he put his fist to his forehead and pooped, thus predicting the fate of Tim Tebow's last game of the 2011-12 NFL season against the New England Patriots. During those days, Luce and I could only tell what day of the week it was by the undershirts Alejandro wore. They literally read Lunes for Monday, Martes for Tuesday, and so on. I averaged 4 hours of sleep, picking up the afternoon and late night feeding and diaper shifts while Luce took the early morning. Yet, I dreaded going back to work. I had my Nuggets face imprinted on the back of my eyelids. I checked my work email to find out that upon my return, I would have to proctor an interim math assessment. As a math teacher, I knew I would have to be there, even though I could legally have stayed home another few days. I didn't want to do it. By it, I meant the whole spectacle. A few days before I went back to work, Luce and I discussed Alejandro's options for schooling. When I first moved to Harlem, I had come on my own, considering only apartments aesthetics and proximity to the local and express trains. My child was a speck in my imagination. Now that he was kicking us outside of Luce's belly, we needed to think, and fast. Quality Head Start programs were likely to cost us a month's combined salary. We saw a few daycare centers that looked welcoming, but the prices scared us. We saw uniformed children of all hues running around our local bodegas and street corners, but there was no way to tell which of them was getting a good education. There's a relationship between how many choices your child has and your income level. And in that, we considered ourselves somewhat privileged. Harlem is one of the flashpoints in the public school versus charter school debate raging across this country. It seems that our neighborhood has become an exercise in experimental schooling. Within a few blocks of my house are the Success Academy Middle School, the Harlem Children's Zone, and Harlem Village Academy, The Dream School with its crisp uniforms and slick advertising, and Democracy Prep, educational institutions that provide a much celebrated alternative to city schools. Former New York City Council member Ava Moskowitz, who runs the Success Academy Charter Schools Network, entices parents by saying that her charter schools are free and public, as if that were somehow exceptional. In fact, charter schools, by their very nature, are supposed to be free and open to the public. Jeffrey Canada, founder of the Harlem Children's Zone, also talks a good game about the concept behind his school, including quote unquote wraparound services, individualized attention that includes guidance counseling and is partly aimed at kids with special needs. It's a great concept in theory, except that in real life, entire classes can and will be removed from the school if they do not meet instructional targets. When it comes to the kids and their education, the school choice model is really one of chance. In the summer of 2013, former New York City Schools Chancellor Joel Klein told a congregation of centralists and entrepreneurs at the Aspen Ideas Festival that he stakes his legacy largely on the surge of charter schools in the city. This got rousing applause from all but one audience member. Guess who? Calling it a social justice issue, Klein repeated. I just figured out that it was him. This got rousing applause from all but one audience member. Guess who? Calling it a social justice issue, Klein repeated the same lines Secretary of Education Arne Duncan and so many others have used. Blame teachers' unions and governmental bureaucracy for the lack of innovation in public schools. I don't believe every charter school is an attack on the public school system. In fact, some of them are community developed, a result of central offices telling parents that if they want to build a new school, a charter school is their only option. Yet, anyone who believes for a second that Klein, former Mayor Michael Bloomberg, or other pro-charter cheerleaders don't have an ulterior motive ought to ask themselves, how can you lead the world's largest public school system, yet rail against it in the same breath? If the problem is really that public schools lack innovation and creativity, why proffer accountability measures that hinder both of those things? As the product of a Jesuit high school education, I have often felt like the school choice movement has marked an awkward transition from religious schools to charter schools. In 2012, Rice High School, the Jesuit Catholic high school and basketball powerhouse in Harlem, closed its doors due to lack of funding. In times of austerity, working with mostly poor Black and Latino kids does not turn a profit. What is clear, frankly, is that if you're in Harlem, school choice doesn't seem like much of a choice at all. It's either charter or more charter. It's easy to get the impression that Harlem has embraced charter schools, but the reality is that charter schools have taken over public and private school buildings en masse. The big charter schools advertise themselves to parents as cleaner, better funded, and free. The sense that they are exclusive and thus superior is enhanced by the fact that parents must win a lottery just to get in. Parents who see children like their own running around Malcolm X Boulevard in crisp uniforms. In a perfect world, I would take Alejandro to our local public school a few blocks away, knowing that every teacher would have the same passion and professional qualifications that his parents do. Footnote 1. Luce is an assistant principal at a transfer high school in Queens and a great teacher regardless of subject. I might be biased. His school administrators would have the time to learn kids' names while also finding ways to manage constant budget cuts. Every counselor, social worker, and school aide would work with the rest of the school in handling students' social and emotional needs. All of these elements of a great school ecosystem would automatically be in place. But Harlem seems to have so few of these elements, and in my experience, the average public school doesn't have all of them. Many of my friends from the suburbs, for example in Scarsdale, New York, tell me that they never had to think about where they would send their children, because the school in the neighborhood was the school. The whole community gathers around this school and holds it accountable when it doesn't reflect the community's values. Teachers are experienced. Administrators follow through on the school's vision, which is steeped in tradition. When springtime comes, graduates fall in line to apply to their colleges of choice. Even when they can't get into their first choice, they have options commensurate to their needs. It's hard to imagine a situation in the suburbs where the local NAACP would have to sue the Department of Education to try to end the co-location of charter and public schools in the same building, a practice that creates separate and unequal conditions within a single facility. Yet, that's what happened in New York City in 2011. In response to the lawsuit, parents countered that they wanted the same choices that richer families had. But in the suburbs, the local school is the school. The lesser choice is still a good choice, and community members can focus their energies on building a school up instead of tearing each other's schools down. Also worth noting, Scarsdale parents often remark that they rarely worry about standardized tests. Speaking of which, can I go to the bathroom? Hurry up. On second thought, all of the people who have to go to the bathroom, just go now before I gotta sign you out. Hurry up. As the procession of boys and girls walks out into the hallway, I look for the special day's roster sheet, sharpened pencils, bathroom log, test booklets, and bubble sheets. I read the test administrator's manual. McGraw-Hill lays out very specific instructions for each grade, each day of testing, and the methods by which its tests must be proctored. We are told exactly what to say and are not to deviate from the script, lest some auditor happens to pass by our school to check our process. I take a breath, partly out of exhaustion from Alejandro's overnight clarion roars, partly out of dread for this grueling process. "Do you think we're going to pass this test?" Amelia blurts out. Instead of my mundane answer, "Of course, you'll be fine, and don't worry about it. It's only a diagnostic test anyway," I let my inner Jose out. "Well, let me see." I flip through the pages. This one we did, this one we didn't. Oh boy, this one. Yeah, we did this one. Yes, no, yes, maybe. I'd say about 60% of this we've covered. Then why do they want us to take it? Because they're mean? No, you're mean. True, but they're meaner. They laugh. No, seriously, I can't understand why they're making us take this stupid test if they know we're not going to do well on it. To be honest, me either. What is this for anyway? Mr. Vilson takes over where Jose left off. Well, teachers would like to see what you've learned and what we need to work on in order to get you ready for the big test. Oh, I see what you mean. But you think this will help us graduate? Well, I waffle here. Yes, it does. Fuck. I really don't want to take this test. I get it. It'll be over in a few minutes. Like defendants awaiting a sentencing, my kids fidget and scrunch their faces. They know they are about to be locked in a silent square box for an hour and a half. "Sir, for how long is this test going to be?" Angie has taken to calling her male teachers sir in her British accent. Unnerving for someone so young, but I'll take it. 90 minutes. Half the class shifts in their seats. A few kids throw in a "come on." Another few go "damn." And one takes the opportunity to fling a piece of paper, or maybe it was the tip of an eraser, at one of his friends. The victim whips around and yells, "Hey, who did that?" I echo the question much more quietly and with a bit more authority. No one responds. I ask again and look at the usual suspects. Jimmy says, "Yo, why do people always think it's me?" Did I say it was you? No. So why are you so paranoid? There's always the one student who does the bad kid trifecta, shakes the seat, snickers loudly, and yells, "I don't want to do this bullshit." Jimmy comes in a half an hour late, with one of the deans trailing him. I hear a, "Get in there!" follow him down the chambers. Mr. Vilson, the professional me, says, "Now, why do we need to yell all that?" "I don't want to take this test." Jose thinks, "Good. Me neither." Mr. Vilson says, "I understand, but don't you want to do well?" "No, I don't want to." "You know how important this is, right?" "Not very, kid." "I don't care." "Yes, you do." "We don't either." "I want to go home." "Now, is it necessary to make all that noise while we're trying to start this test?" "Rebel. Please, rebel." "Fine. I'm going to put my head down because I'm not doing this shit." "Okay, I'll still have your test ready for you." It hurts us almost as much as it hurts you. I start maneuvering through the aisles around desks perfectly aligned in units, handing out bubble sheets and exams with natural ease. I start reading the instructions. "Today, you will take the New York State Interim Examination in Mathematics." One kid moves a bit, then stops after I pause and look in his general direction. "You will have 90 minutes to complete this examination. Use only a number 2 pencil. Do not use pen. Make heavy black marks. Do not make any stray marks and erase such marks completely. Please make sure you use all the time allotted and answer all questions completely. When the time is up, please put your pencils..." When the time is up, please put down your pencils as it is the end of the exam. If you look at the bottom of the page and see the words "Go on," please go on to the next page. When you see the word "Stop," that is the end of the exam. During the time allotted, you may go back and check your work. Are there any questions? I suspire and then wait 5 seconds. In those 5 seconds, I wonder if we can do this testing ritual better. Gouging my eyes out doesn't feel like the most productive use of the next 89 minutes. At the same exact time, across the whole city, thousands of teachers must be contemplating the same thing. For an average of 3 hours a day during the 6-day ritual of examination from the city, plus the 6 to 10 days of official exams from the state, teachers miss out on actually teaching the students. Technically, the actual testing time is roughly 5 to 7% of the school year. In reality, though, it takes much more than that. Teachers have to keep said tests in mind when they prepare their lessons, just in case a certain question shows up, and the whole school system is centered around whether we can bump the numbers up from one standardized test score to the next, down to the 100th percentage point. With all the discussion about closing the achievement gap, curricula, and standards, policymakers rarely take input from the people who need classroom time the most: teachers. You may begin. Actually, policymakers rarely ask us anything until after they've pushed their tools upon us. Thumb drives full of PowerPoint presentations replete with graphics and logos. Mile-high piles of manila folders emblazoned with yet more logos. Teams of 20 and 30-somethings brimming with ambition, but with an average of only 3 years in the classroom. Sets of acronyms for us to memorize and decipher on our own. Our input might get them to change the wording on 1 or 2 sentences in their packets, but when it comes to implementing policy, the rest of the game plan remains the same. Anyone with even a modicum of experience with central offices knows this. In a sense, it feels almost like a pyramid scheme. The structure rarely loses form, even as bricks within it shift. We're not working with bricks, though. We're working with people, many of whom have great ideas, and the current educational paradigm rests on our collective shoulders. So why do we concede to be subservient test proctors? Do we offer our own alternatives or develop our knowledge of pedagogy and practice to challenge inexperienced wannabes who claim to know better? Do we exercise our First Amendment rights only in the confines of our anonymous blogs and teachers' lounges, or do we proactively enumerate and address our grievances through coalition building? Do we see the relationship between the working conditions of teachers and the learning conditions for children? Can we counteract claims that teachers ought to separate the emotional and the professional by integrating our passions into the work that we do? As a society, can we rationalize the seemingly endless deluge of uninspired assessments for our kids? Can we create a balance between developing better students and inspiring better people? Please? You have 10 minutes to complete this test. Annoyed at spending an hour and a half on an interim test that won't tell us very much, I look in the test booklet and mentally do the questions myself. I get 95% correct without scrap paper in just under 7 minutes. I survey the students. Most of them completed the test about 20 minutes ago. Some heads rest on their graphite scuffed desks, snores blowing against the pencils that drop to the floor. The creatives use the backs of their tests as canvases, while the drummer from the school band taps his pencil against the desk to the tune of LMFAO's Party Rock Anthem before I give him the teacher look for the umpteenth time. I whisper that it's appropriate for them to recheck their answers now, trying to keep their minds occupied for the next minute. I can't help but feel that when my students walk out of their exams, they aren't just frustrated by the inordinate amount of testing they're subjected to. They're starting to sense that the process of schooling in and of itself was not actually designed with them in mind. A feeling those of us born into poverty and racism know all too well. By teaching students of color that the best way to succeed is to respond to tests the way the state demands, determine the validity of an argument under the state's rules, and examine essays only if they follow the state's standards, we are creating education via deculturation, or stripping a culture instead of transculturation, a merging of cultures. We didn't land on education reform. Education reform landed on us. But these are thoughts for another time. Please put your pencils down, Mr. Vilson says. You have completed your test. Jose thinks, actually, far from it. Can it be that it was all so simple then? And what's your name? My first real school was PS 140 on the corner of Ridge and Rivington Streets on the Lower East Side of Manhattan. I went there from 1986 to 1994, pre-K to 6th grade. It was a tall, gray, marble and brick building with an intimidating playground, auburn doors, and kids 3 times my size. The school had a smaller and better decorated playground set apart specifically for little cubs like me to insulate from the big kids' playground. A seemingly vast space with jungle gyms, handball courts, a basketball court, and a huge middle space for just about anything, from makeshift wiffle ball to a 50-person game of tag. Almost every wall of the school was bordered by either a school park or a garden. The dark alleyways in between were full of vines and dumped crack vials, a common pathway for people who dealt in nickel and dime bags. Grass and plants tangled with tall black pyramid-tipped iron spikes, decorating the front of the school, an entryway with a few stairs and 6 gray doors. Around 3 every afternoon, kids rushed out of those doors and the streets were flooded with preteens in Jordans and Keds, channeled by adults in ties or police-like blue uniforms. The brown rotunda across the street, PS 142, didn't seem that different from my school. I didn't understand the word zone, choice, or rate of student achievement, or what they had to do with 2 schools separated by a street and a digit. We knew of Our Lady of Sorrows, an elementary Catholic school just a block away from PS 140, but we already had our school. If we wanted to go to OLS for religious reasons, we attended the Saturday program for confirmation and communion. My mother trusted the principal at PS 140 more, so that's where we landed. I couldn't have foreseen that the predominantly Jewish and Puerto Rican veteran school teachers at PS 140, who had seen the tumultuous and triumphant move sorry, who had seen the tumultuous and triumphant moments of the New York City public school system would do so much to prepare us early on for our future academic challenges. On the first day of school, I woke up to my usual routine: a big bowl of Frosted Flakes, some juice, and cartoons on TV. Footnote 2. Along with our daily Our Fathers and pidiendo bendición, seeking a blessing from my mother. With my glasses pushed to the bridge of my nose and my mom walking me to school, I felt a little comfort knowing that our small apartment was a block away. If I had to, I could run back to my oasis and patiently wait for my mom on the stairs. I walked through the school doors and found my way into a green-tiled room with 2 sinks and a ton of kids waiting for instructions from an older lady named Ms. Sussman. "What's your name?" "Jose." Miss Sussman asked us to form a large circle for an icebreaker. We sat cross-legged, quote-unquote Indian style, and listened as our classmates introduced themselves. At some point during the 8th or ninth person's turn, I caught a wave of yuck. It seemed like the people in front of me started swaying back and forth. I couldn't call out because that might be rude to the person speaking, and I didn't want to be that jerk. But then I found a salmon-colored substance flowing out of my mouth and nose. I barfed, covering half of the makeshift circle by the time I finished. Kids stared at me with piercing, wary, judgy eyes. That was my introduction to schooling. Before I could even spell the word, I had already taken an antisocial stance against the establishment. My 8-year commitment to that big gray building suddenly felt like forever and ever. And I had better get used to it, or society might never let me into any doors. For the next 8 years, my classmates and I rushed through the 6th grade entrance doors, up the small staircase that led up to the lobby, past the observant, chatty security guards, and right into that lobby. We waited in the cafeteria for our teachers to pick us up and bring us to class, gnawing on breakfast bits from the free breakfast program, staring at the glass-protected display of the month, glancing at the attendance records to see whose was the highest. We discussed Michael Jordan's ridiculous play against the New York Knicks. Then we lined up and walked through the pristine burgundy hallways and into our respective rooms. We would read in the morning and write a short reflection about what we had read. Then, when the bell rang, we'd switch to math with that same teacher. She'd teach us most of the topics of the day, unless it was science with Miss Miller or computer class with Miss Schlesinger. Footnote 3. Miss Schlesinger's class inspired me to become a computer scientist. She always had the coolest stuff in the school. The new Apple computers, the first dial-up connections, the interactive games. On the other hand, she once told me after I experimented with her computers, "You don't know everything. Pfft, watch me." We got a decent amount of homework, then left for the day. By decent, I mean I still lean a little more forward from the boulder weight books I carried in that book bag. Can it be that it was all so simple then? In those years, students across the nation presumably got the same education I did. They either sat in single row, single file, or in clusters for group projects. They had colorful posters all over the walls with cursive letter strips above the blackboards for lower and uppercase letters. They had the pushover teachers, the warm but demanding and sometimes downright scary teachers. They had parent-teacher conferences where students might be described as struggling, a list of deficiencies rattled off. Our teachers covered everything from gossip to hygiene. My school back then always felt solid. We had a strong principal and a great staff. The lunches generally tasted fresh outside of a few undercooked string beans. We got regular visits from a semi-famous person or company, ostensibly to motivate us, but also to show just how important we were. Our principal always lauded our school for our math, reading, and attendance ranking in the district. I didn't know that the delicate relationships between principal, administrators, and fellow teachers can make or break a school environment, or that added stressors like budgets, test performance, and surrounding neighborhood activities only intensify those relationships in the building. Average spending per pupil for New York State in the early 1990s, when I attended PS 140, was around $7,600, but New York City only saw a $4,448 average. As an adult, I once looked in the paper and found PS 140 on the list of persistently dangerous schools in New York State as of 2007. Pause this reading real quick, so did I, for my middle school. What is up with that? All right, back to it. Even after it was removed from the list in 2009, I couldn't believe it. In the 80s and 90s, I had always felt in the 80s and 90s, I had always felt it was safe and believed I was getting the best education possible. My naivete was the byproduct of a limited scope I had as a child. But things also changed in 2 decades, including an entire profession. In many ways, such a school feels atypical today. Had our current heightened accountability measures been in place then, they would have likely snipped the warm and fuzzies I felt walking down the hallways. The school building may feel the same and the classrooms may not have changed much, but can a school preserve a warm environment when it is beholden to the cold calculus of keeping up test scores? Individually, the way teachers remember their years in school is often indicative of how they view good education, even if it didn't really work for everyone. It always starts off the same. When I was a student, teachers used to blank and we'd learn because blank. And that's why I do it that way. Some school leaders believe that asking their teachers to think back to the way they were taught could reveal the key to every student's education. We could fill those blanks in with the most inane practices, and people within earshot would nod and say, "Yeah, and something similar worked for me too." Here's a snippet of some actual dialogue I've heard in the teacher's lounge. Teacher A: when I was a student, my teacher used to draw lettuce next to the most important points of her notes, and that worked because I could identify with lettuce, and it would get us all hungry, so we'd want to work harder for that lettuce. What did she just say? Teacher B: I'm with you. I had one teacher who put on a clown face whenever we discussed books like Of Mice and Men and Flowers for Algernon. I really understood the book then, and the rest of the class enjoyed it too. Jose, if you just smirk, it will all go away. Teacher C: well, my original language is French, and based on what my teacher said, he speaks the best French, and there really is no other French that makes any sense to me. And when I learned it, I knew it was the best because other people told me how great it was. So there I go. Oh, hell no. Rather than mumbling under my breath, I should have asked, are you sure every kid in your class has actually learned? Most of us in the teaching profession have a great collective mentality, but one of the major failures of groupthink is assuming every teacher who agrees with us is a reincarnation of the average student we grew up with. It's not true. Logically speaking, people who participate in this type of discussion are saying that almost everyone who is within our age range, income level, education level, and profession learned the material exactly that way, and that's why it was so effective. Every generation of students has its set of social signifiers, and within individual classrooms, a language apart from the standard that exists throughout the rest of the school. As a teacher, for example, I get students' collective attention. As a teacher, for example, to get students' collective attention, I used to count 5, 4, 3, all eyes on me. The second I said it, someone inevitably echoed, "All eyes on me," with an imitation Tupac voice. I would make a teacher face at the student who echoed me, but was encouraged by the wit nonetheless. Another example, when I ask students to turn to a page in our textbooks, start from the bottom, and work their way up, someone always cuts me off and says, "Started from the bottom, now we're here." Drake didn't start from the bottom, but he ended up in my classroom because I said those words. Would I have struck a nerve in the school without a bit of hip-hop knowledge? Perhaps not. Do I still teach math properly? It depends on context and audience, largely. Classrooms require teachers to get to know their students before trying to teach them anything else. And this is no less true where the students are hardest to teach. In no way do I suggest buying a Lil Wayne record and incorporating his slang into the classroom, but our students have a culture that's both authentic and unique to them. If you can tap into that energy, you have a way to reach them in ways that even our own teachers couldn't. As educators, what I would say is, my teacher taught me this way, and it worked for me and a few of my friends, so that's why I'm teaching this way. We could also take it a step further and say, I'm open to other, possibly more effective ways of teaching the material based on research and improving my pedagogy to reach the most children possible. We can own up to the idea that the people attending these meetings usually were the good students, the good kids in their elementary school classes. I have thought about every kid I shared a class with in elementary school, middle school, and high school. I don't know that I considered whether they had learned the material as well or better than I did, but I think the whole class was doing as well as I was. I remember the faces my teachers made after they handed back our quizzes. Probably not. Self-motivation is important, of course. Throughout my elementary years, I read voraciously and sought to show off my skills via quizzes and tests. Since I had no access to my father's native Creole, I wanted to make absolutely sure I knew more than enough Spanish to stay in conversation with my mother's family. So I taught myself how to read and write in Spanish using the New Testament. The ways I learned out of school translated to how I learned in school, which often made the process of schooling boring. Did I side-eye the winners of the best homework awards at the year-end school ceremonies? Absolutely. Was I jealous? Yes, to an extent. Maybe I just thought that my work ethic didn't match my intellect because I learned better when I went at my own pace, which was anything from a jog to warp speed, depending on whom you ask. But students' paths also get determined from a young age in a way that doesn't always encourage self-motivation. New York elementary schools split students up into 3 to 4 classes, often separating the lowest and highest achievers. With a few switches here and there, students get tracked as a unit until middle school, where the shuffle happens again, this time with a different principal and a different set of students who may or may not recognize each other from the neighborhood. These days, school choice has made it so that a school can get students right from the neighborhood or a few miles away, depending on the central district's calculations. After 8th grade, students put 12 high schools on a list and hope to get caught in the web of one of them. Otherwise, they fall down the cracks to a second round of lotteries. During this fuzzy period, students start to see the writing on the wall. Those with strong grades usually get chosen for their first choice high school. Students with weaker grades have to attend the default school, usually a school pegged for low expectations and more open admissions. The high school's names often feature a specialization, like medicine, art, or law, but most offer the same exact courses with very few variations, according to some of my former students. The architecture doesn't exactly motivate students to come to school. Most of the large high schools that have been broken up into smaller schools share facilities like the gym, the cafeteria, or the classroom, a transparent flaw of the smaller schools movement. The entrances still have police guards and metal detectors. The windows still have tight grid window guards. The hallways are still dimly lit and painted in the most uninspired colors possible. Today, browsing my yearbooks and Facebook friends, I have a good sense of who among my elementary school classmates went to college and who didn't. Some started families early on, moved to another state, entered the military or law enforcement, or got other service jobs just to maintain a good standard of living. Others tripped into lots of trouble, sold or used drugs, and still battle their inner demonios to get to the next day. The characteristics that lead to success are such volatile variables. A few of us may be successful by society's definitions, rich or famous, but seeing what I did growing up, my definition of success has to accommodate people who are generally managing to live fruitful, positive lives. Who gets to write their edgy memoirs? How would my classmates speak to their educational experiences? Would they feel the same way I do? Why do we place so much emphasis on just effort if we know that any number of factors can affect a student's personal journey through school? As children, we are told repeatedly that we need only the wherewithal to survive and excel in the business of schooling. As adults who were once children, we ought to see that the combination of events, no matter their size, that got us to our present is what put us on our life's eventual trajectory. Band of Brothers. When someone asks me if I ever joined a frat, I tell them the same story. I considered a few when I was in college, but that time's past. I'm good. Fraternities may serve a purpose for some, and I certainly had an interest in a few, especially of the purple and gold variety. I shrugged casually, because the person who usually asks me either joined such an organization or has considered doing so. Then I think about the other colors and values I'm associated with, and I'm relieved that I already have a whole network of people bounded by this set of experiences through a small Catholic middle school on the Lower East Side. One night in 2011, I got to hang out with this band of brothers for my good friend Victor Cirillo's Washington, D.C. or Bust party at Slate's, an Irish establishment on Bowery Street in the East Village. By the way, no one calls it Bowery Street. Please drink something. As I looked around with Biggie's Juicy blaring through the bar speakers, I reminisced about my years at Nativity Mission School, an independent Catholic middle school on the Lower East Side. Located on Forsyth Street and aimed at serving underprivileged youth from the neighborhood, the former apartment building might not look so remarkable from the outside, but anyone who has spent even 10 minutes inside during a regular school day can't miss it. I thought about the red brick, the black fire escapes, the concrete backyard with the odd hoops, the seemingly endless staircases, the metal park table, the storage closet, the ping pong table, the basement you never wanted to go into unless that ping pong ball dropped down the stairs, the washing machines for the boys' sports uniforms, the tight spaces that assured no one could ever get lost, the little closet that held basketballs and our student shop, and the walls that housed classes for the last 3 decades. During the summer months every year from 1994 to 1998, I attended a 6-week program that was associated with Nativity Mission at Camp Montserrat on the private property in Lake Placid, New York. Designed to provide leadership training for current and prospective Nativity students, the program involved hiking up the largest peaks in New York's Adirondacks mountain range, along with canoeing, swimming, and prayer. It was a huge departure from summers in the city, and it was during those summers in one of our evening sessions that I was first introduced to the movie Stand and Deliver. Starring Edward James Olmos as Jamie Escalante, maybe Jaime Escalante, the acclaimed mathematics teacher in East LA who got his high school students to learn calculo against all odds. The film was unlike anything I had ever seen. Father Jack showed it to us every summer, trying to inspire us to achieve the seemingly unachievable. It was just one of the ways in which our trips to that grassy ridge in Lake Placid gave Latino boys from the city a chance to see something they might not have otherwise. We ate grilled cheese sandwiches and pork chops with a refreshing cup of lemonade, keeping our elbows off the table or else we wouldn't get seconds. We swept floors with our bare hands, learned how to make our beds with folded hospital corners, and took 5-minute showers. Camp was our pledging, and if we roughed it out, we made it. Young men like us had no choice but to give it our all. Along with introducing me to Jaime Escalante, it was Father Jack who prompted me to use my gifts to improve myself, not to harbor hate for others. During the school year, he drove me to my spelling bees, making sure to slip in a few lessons about life on the way. Maybe it was because he heard so many of our confessions, or because he spoke what seemed like 30 languages, but he had a way about him that could pull the most anxious among us off the ledge. If you look at your teaching career, you've been trying to create that nativity experience ever since you started, Lou said to me one day. She has a way with words too. For all my years of schooling, more than any other institution, Nativity taught me about myself. I learned about the 14 Stations of the Cross from my Saturday Catholic school at Our Lady of Sorrows, but I found my spirituality from Nativity. Xavier High School completed my learning of Jesus' teachings, but Nativity pushed me to the idea of walking on water. Even now, while the red brick building has slowly been deconstructed and in its place lies the frame for a high-rise condominium in a neighborhood 12 years deep into gentrification, the spirit of Nativity still remains where two or more of us are gathered. The Lower East Side still retains the small clothing shops on Orchard Street, Cat's Delicatessen, the projects near the East River, maybe, and the New Eurekan Cafe. But Nativity could no longer state its purpose to be helping the poor after the poor were forced to flee to less prosperous and inflated properties. Nativity as an institution had to move somewhere it could retain its mission statement. Nativity as a building felt more isolated. The cohesion of these boys turned men, some of whom may not know or like each other, is centered on the image of that little school that could. Father Jack keeps saying that Nativity isn't a building but a community, made up of generations of people affected by this meek institution, no matter how much we protest. Nativity was and is about paying service forward, and its leaders hope to find a place where they can build a new legend and a new bond with kids who otherwise wouldn't have a chance. Years later, I would find myself trying to do the same for my students. What happened? Harlem winters still showcase full moons above 116th Street and Malcolm X Boulevard at 6:30 a.m., just to the side of the dome of Clara Muhammad Elementary and Secondary School. As I walk the silent, tenebrous streets toward the C train, my iPod plays Kanye West's Dark Fantasy. The thump of the bass line in step with my pace sets the mood. With a second verse, he piques my curiosity with an interpolation of Slick Rick's Teacher Teacher. Hey teacher teacher, tell me how do you respond to students? And refresh the page and restart the memory, respark the soul and rebuild the energy. We stop the ignorance, we kill the enemies. My vigorous head nodding pauses just long enough for me to reflect on these lines. Did he just provide a framework for the future of pedagogy for our students, particularly those most disenfranchised by this system? In reflecting on my own education, I often reiterate the many ways my own teachers helped me mature as a student, but I also had experiences that occasionally make me wish I had openly rebelled. Most students take a passive-aggressive route to defy their teachers, which really works to teachers' advantage because it doesn't require them to reconsider what in their pedagogy may have incited such a reaction. Despite the plethora of studies and papers written about teachers as learners, Paulo Freire comes to mind here. Footnote number 4. Freire, a Brazilian scholar and author of the best-selling Pedagogy of the Oppressed, attempts to reframe education as a progressive transfer of power. Instead of a top-down teacher-student dynamic, Freire proposes that everyone in the system, from students to the community, has something to learn from one another, thus creating increasingly more fluid titles for entities in the classroom based on needs of the surrounding community. Despite the plethora of studies and papers written about teachers as learners, Paulo Freire comes to mind here, the top-down structure of schooling has long stifled independent thought. I first became aware of this in 7th grade, when a discussion with my language arts teacher, Mr. Missel, became an argument. A tall man with a sharp voice known for his coffee thermos resembling a weapon of mass destruction, Mr. Missel always had a nervous twitch, probably from too much caffeine. None of us dared question it. One day, he gave our class a well-deserved 3-minute break at the end of the period. As 7th grade children are wont to do, we chatted amongst ourselves about the NBA, video games, or anything else that took our minds off the rigors of schooling, getting louder and louder with each passing minute. Mr. Missel called out to me with something I couldn't hear, and I responded with, "What happened?" That was apparently a big mistake. Mr. Missel corrected me and said, "You ought to use 'excuse me' instead." I couldn't hear that either, so I said, "What happened?" "Jose, again, you need to use 'excuse me.'" Wait, what happened? Jose, if you don't stop it for every time you use what happened, I'm going to make you write it 100 times. At this point, my classmate Achilles kept shaking his head at me and saying, "Oh my God, no!" I didn't hear any of what Mr. Missile said to me, but they were under the impression that I did. What happened? 100. What happened? 200. What happened? 300. By the time he counted to 1,100, Achilles was practically jumping out of his desk to stop me. I was in shock. What happened felt appropriate because I actually wanted to know what had happened. Apparently, Mr. Missile preferred "excuse me," a term I would have reserved for passing by somebody. Later that night, after finishing my real homework, I started my punishment assignment at 9:30 p.m. My mother peeked in to see what I was up to, but I had a hard time explaining in my broken Spanish what had happened. After line 839, I didn't see the point of the assignment, only that I had been punished for waxy ear canals and temporary idiocy. By line 1099, my hands pounded the table where through my clenched teeth I said, "Make it stop." By line 1100, the assignment had worked. Mr. Missile had, even temporarily, stifled the phrase, shoving it into the deepest recesses of my vernacular. More importantly, I had unconsciously run into the dichotomy between schooling and education. Education should be the set of actions and processes by which educators, students, and parents work together to help future citizens succeed and contribute to general society. Egalitarian as that sounds, most people I've spoken to believe in that vision in one form or another. On the other hand, we have this concept of schooling as a set of procedures that happen in a continuum irrespective of and often despite whether the students actually learn anything, like commuter trains running on a schedule. I could blame Mr. Missile's punishment on a misunderstanding, but I also see it as symptomatic of the schooling process, which often fails to account for other children's literacy, as if the code that children speak has no value compared to the King's English. The train must keep going, even if the passengers don't want to hop on. The cultural and class disconnect between many educators and their students is as much to blame for the countercultural movements among some kids of color as any other influences. Social conservatives often point to current rap music's misogyny and violence. Footnote 5. Not to excuse rap's issues with these isms, but white-dominated forms of music also have binders full of issues with misogyny and violence. Worse still, even if we don't see it in the music, it's often permissible in backstage VIP areas at concerts and clubs, off-campus houses, or concert mosh pits under the guise of drugs and rock culture. Alas. Social conservatives often point to current rap music's misogyny and violence as the reason why today's kids don't pay attention to their teachers, or any adult for that matter. Yet there is a long tradition of rap and hip hop inspiring young people to seek an education, not a schooling, mind you, that schools could not always provide. That goes for public, private, or any type of school. In the mid to late 90s, rap albums displayed an ostensible anti-intellectualism that encouraged bucking formal schooling as a measure of success. In 1991, a 19-year-old Busta Rhymes admitted to early mischief in International Zone Coaster with "No need to make bets cause I met a bookie. Today is the day the whole school plays hooky." Later in the 1990s, the Notorious B.I.G. did this in Juicy when he quipped that this album is dedicated to all the teachers who told me I'd never amount to nothing. As recently as 2011, Jay-Z did the same in Who Gon' Stop Me. Graduated to the MoMA, I did all of this without a diploma. Graduated from the corner, y'all can play me for the motherfucking fool if you wanna. Street smart and I'm book smart, could have been a chemist cause I cook smart. These Brooklyn kids all went to the same high school around the same time, became extremely successful by their early 20s, and found themselves revered in pop culture not for their obvious intelligence, but for their musical... Mr. Vilson has used the word talent. I want to use the word genius. In other words, while schooling might have worked for some, it obviously failed some intelligent yet distracted children of color who had to find other ways to express their discontent with the schooling they received. The lore of their message is how it dismisses the schooling narrative of if you work hard, behave good, and get good grades, you'll do well in life. That's true for many, but our most disaffected students don't see themselves in the curriculum and thus have to find their own outside of school. Kids today have the correct impression that people have more fun outside of school, yet few adults ever think about actually changing the schooling so kids can get an education. The children of color children of color have had a different unjust education even before this current education reform, public, private, and otherwise. This is how many of our children choose to respond. Other People's Children by world-renowned education scholar Lisa Delpit articulates this problem well and offers solutions. Reading the chapter titled Language Diversity and Learning, I couldn't get past how much of it reflected my own experience. She writes, teachers need to support the language that students bring to school, provide them input from an additional code, and give them the opportunity to use the new code in a non-threatening, real communicative context. Footnote 6, Lisa Delpit, Other People's Children, New York, New Press, 2006, page 53. When students bring a different understanding of the English language into the classroom, teachers need to be able to look past the difference in usage so that they can see students' competencies and ideas. Without realizing it, Mr. Missel's approach to language arts only fueled my abandonment of the English canon. Harder to swallow was his rule in questioning my code of English, positioning himself as owner of the true, authentic version. I did well academically, but I was still antisocial and a misfit. Even my teachers probably found this brown know-it-all who probably just needed some guidance a bit obnoxious. I knew of hip-hop the way we know of expensive clothes behind pristine glass windows. When I sneaked in listening sessions of hip-hop radio station Hot 97 in my bedroom, I felt it in my bones. Not because I ever dealt drugs or shot a man with a .38 pistol, but because I lived in a neighborhood where I saw and heard it all myself far too often. I felt the underlying anger of these young men who, behind their bravado and hypermasculinity, revealed a sore spot in their hearts because they felt the world around them didn't actually belong to them. For a month or two, I found myself disenchanted with schooling. In some respects, I stopped participating altogether. I eventually developed a me against the world mentality, appropriate for the spring of 1995 when Tupac released an album with the same name. When I listened to it, something about his critique and social rebellion felt real to me. Comparisons between hip-hop and the classroom abound. Hip-hop has different forms of response that traditional classroom doesn't allow. In response to a song, people can dance, mimic, remix, or cover it with their own lyrics. They can draw or write. Rap music asks us to pay careful attention the first time, but express ourselves by the second time we hear it. Language flourishes in real time. The next time we convene to listen to a song with our friends or at a party or a concert, we need not assess whether everyone knows it all. Rap turns the whole idea of standards on its head by saying, you need skills to do what I do, but if you enjoy what I do, you do what I do. As long as you got soul, you're in. In other words, I belonged here. Some educators in America still leave admittance to the process of schooling up for debate. Some children might thrive in traditional schooling because their particular talents and ethics are a good match for that environment. But many others simply don't. They become denizens of the corner, the hustlers of rap lyrics. Schooling builds a dichotomy between those for whom schooling works and those for whom it does not. Those of us who play in both worlds become linguists just by discerning between the English spoken in the schools and the English spoken by the broke, because I refuse to call it broken English. Because I do prefer code switching. Yet I write in many versions of English. In the face of resistance from the official arbiters of my language, many of us can still read and write English well. You might even wonder what the hell happened. Negotiating my own skin. As children, we didn't understand what difference meant systemically. We saw teachers come bright and early to prepare their classrooms, placing desks in circles or in rows. We saw clean hallways more often than not, and administrators waiting out in front of the school, waving at parents and community members. Taking tests, while no thrill, didn't stress us out too much because our teachers reassured us that they just wanted to compare what we had learned with others. School was school, until we got to see what life was like past the Hudson River. In the 1990s, most of my friends tuned in to The Fresh Prince of Bel-Air, the sitcom starring Will Smith as a poor kid from a rough neighborhood, adjusting to life in the affluent Los Angeles neighborhood of Bel-Air with his Uncle Phil Banks and Aunt Vivian Banks, both successful professionals. While The Cosby Show had spoken to the African American experience and tried to cast middle class black life in a positive light, Fresh Prince spoke to a culture clash and escapism that resonated with us in the same way Eric B. and Rakim's Paid in Full had for the previous generation. We had never seen affluence firsthand, but mansions and preppies made their way into our vocabulary through these shows. Along the way, television also showed us what school looked like for rich folk. When Will Smith's character strolled through Bel-Air Academy, we saw wooden walls and shiny tiled floors and assumed it had open spaces that allowed for sports other than basketball and street baseball. Carlton Banks, Uncle Phil's not black enough son, worked as Will's foil, the product of the American dream, yet stripped of the grounded sense of black history. While he succeeds easily at the process of schooling, his real education comes from his shocking encounters with Will's disruptive personality. Thus, through the relationships between Will and Carlton, and Will and Phil, Fresh Prince speaks directly to the struggles chronicled in the writings of Carter G. Woodson, specifically The Miseducation of the Negro, 1933. In the book, Woodson describes the education system as a means of programming people's worldviews. If Bel-Air Academy subdued and negated Carlton's blackness by calling him a success as he moved up the ladder, Will's extroverted personality was seen as a failure of the Academy's ability to civilize this wild one, no matter what his final SAT score tells us about his actual capacity for learning. Footnote 7. In the episode The Alma Mater, Will gets into Princeton University, Carlton's dream school, just by being himself during the interview, and scoring in the 91st percentile on the SATs. I didn't fully experience this difference until I went to high school. In 1996, I entered Xavier High School, a 150-year-old independent Jesuit university preparatory high school for young men on Manhattan's West Side. I chose Xavier because for all the Catholic all-boys schools in New York City, it had the best mix of rigorous academics and locale. With a high GPA out of middle school, I made it into Xavier on academic scholarship, without which my mother would have never been able to afford the tuition for such an elite institution. Xavier prides itself on football, rugby, the marching band, and not having to take the New York State Regents exams, a testament to the steep academic climb students must undertake in order to graduate. It took 30 minutes by bus from the Lower East Side to get to Chelsea, the neighborhood Xavier called home. To some, that might sound like a long commute, but I was able to get home in a reasonable hour from extracurricular activities while still getting a slice of life in another neighborhood. Xavier High School at the time was 78% white, with a relatively even distribution of Asians, Latinos, and blacks. So it was a bit of a culture shock. Before I arrived at Xavier, my contact with white people had primarily been in the form of police officers, priests, teachers, and more police officers. The remaining white people on my radar wore spandex Sorry, this is funny. The remaining white people on my radar wore spandex pants and ripped their shirts off in steroid-induced rages like Hulk Hogan or Randy Macho Man Savage, played dad to two adopted black kids like Phil Drummond, or played on the 1992 Olympic Dream Team, the only one that counts, like John Stockton and Chris Mullin. White people felt so omnipresent in the culture that surrounded me, I could easily imagine how the average white person lived. On the other hand, it was impossible to imagine the average white person knowing how I lived, outside of whatever rap videos and movies like Boys in the Hood told them. The first CD, remember those, I ever bought was Janet Jackson's Design of a Decade. My immediate second, Alanis Morissette's Jagged Little Pill. I delved into alternative rock and electronic music partly as a way of shielding my mom and God from knowing that I thoroughly enjoyed the notorious B.I.G.'s Big Papa and Dr. Dre's Let Me Ride, with all the bullshits and chronic mentions unfiltered. I grew up on Daisy Fuentes and MTV's Headbangers Ball, and when my family moved to the projects, cable access pulled Guns N' Roses and Snoop Doggy Dogg into my house. Conflicted and overwhelmed by the range of pop culture thrown in my direction, I dabbled in as much as possible. Perhaps I didn't want to feel limited in my conversations, but it had the effect of displacing me from many of the groups I had thought I fit into. My discomfort with my own skin didn't help, and now I would go to a school populated My discomfort with my own skin didn't help, and now I would go to a school populated by with boys with considerable economic, intellectual, and physical swagger. Nevertheless, in my first couple of years of high school, I asserted myself as a confident student determined to make his mark out of the gate. I enrolled in all the honors classes I could, took up a few clubs, and maintained a good enough average for first and second honors each quarter. In my first year, my grades were in the top 10% of my class, right where I felt I belonged. But I also committed to a self-taught crash course in extreme code switching. At Nativity, I had white teachers who had made efforts to build bridges between their world and ours. Some of them, like my 7th grade English teacher, Miss Miranda, had engaged with our community for years, showing a clear sense of empathy, as well as high expectations for her students. Others, like my 8th grade math and science teacher, Mr. Murphy, were young enough to acclimate to our music and style, dropping pop culture and basketball references into their teaching. Xavier was different. There I was, most at home in the lunchroom, surrounded by fellow Nativity alumni. I fell back into my street slang as we complained about our teachers. My friends and I tried our best to stick together, but only saw each other outside of class and after school, when we would take the F train downtown to Nativity to play 3-on-3 basketball almost every afternoon until 5. On the way home, we griped more about our teachers, but we shared a deep-seated responsibility to succeed. We wouldn't let each other drop out. The instruction we received at Nativity rang in our ears, as if Father Jack himself was telling us, "If you can climb the tallest mountains in New York State, you can handle this, right?" "Yes, Father." In my honors and advanced classes, I toned down the hood in me, mimicking instead the academic language of my teachers and fellow students. For every teacher who nominated me for an award or peer who helped me with my math homework, there were others who refused to negotiate their heirs for a pudgy black kid they thought was trying to act white. When we discussed poetry or contemporary music in class, kids would say things like, "Jose, can you rap some Maze for us?" Boys will always rib each other, but prompting the black kid to rap didn't sit well with me. Even if I did have the 1997 through 1999 Bad Boy Records catalog memorized, I didn't see myself as anyone's urban jukebox. In everyone else's eyes, it looked innocent. So as with many microaggressions, I left it alone. Microaggressions, those little ostensibly innocent actions that highlight a person's privilege or lack thereof, are a concept I wish I had had at my disposal back then. We are taught to think of racism as looking like pointy white hoods, but microaggressions are much more common and complex. At Xavier, we embrace the championship-winning Yankees as a symbol of New York pride and multiculturalism. The team included an Italian Cajun lefty, Andy Petit, a Cuban defector, Orlando Hernandez, an all-boys Jesuit school wizard, David Cohn, a collection of fielders and pitchers from all over Latin America, Mariano Rivera, Ramiro Mendoza, Tino Martinez, Jorge Posada, and a biracial kid from Kalamazoo, Derek Jeter, led by Italian manager Joe Torre. When the Yankees won a championship, Xavier celebrated with dress down days and a day off so we could get to the parade. Baseball made race relations look easy. At the same time, the kids of color and some white students had not so secret discussions that highlighted the racial divisions that ran through our school. For example, the annual debate over whether the black kid or the white kid deserved a spot on the school basketball team. The team only had 12 spots, and there were at least 50 boys willing to do running drills, push-ups, and whatever else the coaches asked to get on that team. Every fall, we'd speculate who would make it based on what we saw in gym class. Our football and rugby teams always got citywide and nationwide recognition, while the basketball teams, skilled as they were, simply couldn't hang with the likes of Rice or LaSalle. Thus, in our school, any discussion about who was nice in ball had a racial component. The ball teams we saw on TV were predominantly black with white coaches. Xavier's basketball team looked like the coaches didn't want to let go of their Hoosiers fantasies. We'd laugh. But when the roster came out for the basketball team and the 12th man was white, the debates got fierce. How is he on the team when half of the black kids we saw on the practice court are better than that dude? Those not-so-secret lunch conversations became a roar, with one table of mostly black kids shaking their heads for the whole lunch period. When this happened during my senior year, the tension got so bad that students organized a spontaneous 5-on-5. One team had the starters from the varsity basketball team. The other was made up of the best players who hadn't made the squad. It was a black and white affair. One coach I ran into leaving the gym clearly didn't know how to address it. How could he? As the bell sounded, the juniors and seniors watching the game had broken up into two sides, the Italian and Irish students versus the students of color. No one fought, but each cheered their side on. No one spoke about it afterward. No one knew the actual score. No one won. These tensions existed among the faculty too. For every mass, we had to gather as a community. We had a black or Latino teacher who felt slighted or left abruptly for reasons I didn't fully understand. Mr. Caesar, an assistant principal my freshman year, was one of the handful of black men in the school. He stood at 6'3" with a suit and tie, rattling the halls with his sonorous tones. An alum himself, Mr. Caesar had everyone's respect. Even his smile demanded every student's attention. When our headmaster became the president of Xavier High School, we all assumed Mr. Caesar would become the new headmaster. However, let's call him Father C, took over, with the higher-ups explaining that they wanted to reserve the headmaster position for an ordained priest. As the news spread at lunch, the kids of color snickered. The "we wanted a priest" argument seemed credible, yet it just didn't feel right. It felt even worse when Mr. Caesar left for another school the next year. Father C, as we called him, was a good headmaster. What I most admired about him was his willingness to sit with the nativity boys at lunch. He had heard about us from Father Jack, and at first his bi-weekly 5-minute visits to our table unnerved us. By then, I had gained a reputation for my good grades, but also my constant lateness. Without his grace, I might have lost my scholarship after my grades dipped. He also rounded up funds for me and my friends to get our graduation rings, an act of generosity that only further complicated my relationship with Xavier as a school. How could I negotiate the pride and humility I felt about so many of the experience I had here with the interracial turmoil playing out with me, to me, around me? Every year, it felt like one of my black or Latino classmates left for LaSalle Academy or Cardinal Hayes High School, schools with reputations for more people of color on their rolls. I didn't have language for it, but my awareness of privilege was becoming more palpable than the funk emanating from our lockers on gym day. During Christmas break my junior year, one of my aunts died of leukemia, and it devastated my family for the rest of that holiday. After I came back to school, a priest I confided in prayed for my family and me. A few days later, our guidance counselor rounded up a group of us together and asked us to share something about our winter breaks. Everyone shared something mundane: the foods they ate, the places they traveled, the family sharing gifts around a pine tree. When it was my turn, in a rare moment of candor, I confided that my aunt had died, so my Christmas break had been spent mostly in mourning. The guidance counselor looked at me, eyes as blank as a new sheet of loose leaf, and said, "Okay, so anyway." I imagined the round dinner tables of my classmates, turkey in the middle, Christmas lights glistening above the head of the table, grinning, sharing jokes, calibrating each other's experiences with others like them. I already understood my experiences as different, my isolation clear from the moment the guidance counselor anticipated a different response. The tragedy that beset my family may have surprised everyone in that session, but the ambivalent response felt prepared, more an institutional response to kids of color than a personal misunderstanding on the counselor's part. Otherwise, I might have asked, "Can we meet in private after this?" Which is what guidance counselors generally get trained to do for their children. I learned how to parse the things I couldn't control from the things that I could, but this tension kept tugging at my collar. It just never pulled me to the point of anger until my junior year, when I took English 11 honors. As usual, I was one of just 2 kids of color in the class. The other kid of color was one of the few black student athletes we wanted representing us on the basketball team. The teacher was legendary. He had more than a half a century of teaching under his belt and was revered for his intellect and mastery of his subject. It was rumored that he kept every single paper from every student he had ever had in a secret room upstairs, just to make sure no one copied from anyone else. Everyone I ever asked had nothing but high praise for him, so getting that 11H tag on my schedule felt like a privilege. During the year I spent in his class, I found myself constantly wondering when I would make my breakthrough. Paper after paper, no matter how much time I cared and invested, the highest grade I received was an 85. My classmates got their papers back littered with red marks, just like mine, yet they all received consistent scores of 90 or higher. Patiently waiting for a chance to prove my mettle, I told myself repeatedly that my own lack of intellectual fortitude had led to my low grades my first semester. After my 12th straight 80-something score on a paper, I went back to Nativity to visit Father Jack and ask him what I could do. He suggested I speak to the teacher. The next morning, I tried to approach him before class, but he waved me off and sent me to my seat. Fair enough. I was used to waiting for the things that I wanted. I just couldn't wash my mouth of the sour taste of another 85 on another paper. I sat there seething, waiting my turn to prove him wrong. A few weeks later, we were preparing for another exam when the teacher asked me to read a question out loud. I read it as clearly as possible. He asked me what the answer was. I said, D. Everyone in the class nodded. He said, "What?" I said, D. Everyone looked at the teacher again. He said, "What?" I didn't hear that. I yelled, "D!" startling my classmates. The teacher just waved a hand at me and said, "Well, you don't know anything, so I'll move on. Tom, what about you?" Tom, sitting next to me, said, D. Good answer. That's the right answer. Good job there. My eyes dropped lower than my jaw. The rest of the class laughed nervously. I almost couldn't believe it. I didn't have the vocabulary at the time to discuss the incident or the culmination of other experiences that hinted at racial bias, but it was clear to me that some people I had once assumed had my best interest at heart did not. Up to that point, acting white had been a means of survival, assuring that people couldn't deny me access to schooling or anything else because of their perceptions when I reflected their speech patterns, their interests, and their version of history. This teacher had negotiated my grades with my skin already. After that incident, my optimism for racial harmony, at least in high school, was dashed. By that time, I had played the trombone at the Columbus Day Parade, taken on the role of Superman at the last minute for the freshman play, fundraised for the David Cone Foundation, and volunteered in the pediatric unit of New York Presbyterian Hospital. I had been included in the Who's Who among American high school students collection, yet I still found myself wondering who the hell I thought I was. In my senior year history class, we were assigned a paper on the topic of our choosing. I chose slavery and picked up Chinua Achebe's Things Fall Apart, a book I had first bought in 6th grade at a library book sale. After one of my teachers took it, lost it, and brought another, less valuable, edition of the book for me, I lost interest in reading it. In retrospect, I blacked up the paper on purpose. I don't recall the title, but I know I threw slavery in and white people a few times for good measure. In one of the few things I remember from the thesis, I dismissively proclaimed that even as some of us get dressed up in uniform, white people still look at us the way slave masters looked at slaves. A few days later, my history teacher handed back everyone's paper but mine and whispered to me, "Can I see you after class?" I knew I had stepped in it. He pulled me aside after class and told me that the paper was racist drivel and I should take everything back, or else. I certainly didn't want to hurt anyone's feelings, even though I probably needed to mature in my own understanding of race. Yet, I didn't feel anything either Achebe or I had said was untrue. Still, I recanted it all, with regret and resentment simmering in my belly. That same year, the teacher who had humiliated me in class my junior year passed away, and Xavier students were invited to attend a special open casket service. When it was my turn to pray in front of his casket, I couldn't bear it. I sat out in the dimly lit hallway and cried. Most people assumed I was upset at his death, and to a certain extent I was. Yet I was more upset at the hurt and hate he let seep into my heart. That he would die before I got to tell him about myself bothered me more than anything else. In those moments of despair, one of my saving graces came while singing for the choir my junior and senior years. Miss Kittney, with whom I still keep in touch to this day, unlocked a voice I didn't know I had. She was one of the few teachers in the building who got it. I didn't have much of an interest in singing until I got cast in the school musical South Pacific in 1997. When she first invited me to sing for her choir after the musical, I replied, "Why would you want to do that to your choir?" I accepted anyway, despite my trepidation about performing. Every mass felt like an assessment of my progress, and I probably failed more times than I passed. I went from singing as part of the choir to taking the role of cantor. Some people doubted my voice, saying that it cracked. It did, which made my soul sore for a week. But Miss Kittney just worked harder with me, waiting patiently for her faith to be rewarded. During my last mass before graduation, she just looked at me and signaled to the mic. I don't remember much besides her crying at the bass as the bass took over my voice box. As she walked away from me, trying to wipe her tears, I looked at the book of canticles in front of me and wondered whether I'd ever have a chance to use my voice this well again. Even if I wasn't going to sing with it, I never had her as one of my core subject teachers, but what she taught me about the power of my voice was one of the most important lessons I took away from my experience at Xavier High School. Praise be to God. It's not about salary. Before college, I only had one black male teacher. His name was Mr. Wingate, and he taught computer applications in 12th grade. He didn't teach me anything profound, since Microsoft products don't lend themselves to intellectual depth or deep revelations, but he made an impression. He caught hell for his bow ties and diction, speaking too properly and taking himself rather seriously. His speech seemed to be a mockery of what the students thought was English. If I've done the math correctly, out of the 50 or so teachers I've had in my lifetime, only 2 or 3 of them were men of Black or Latino descent. For someone who was born and raised in New York City, that's staggering. You're allowed to wonder why that's so important. After all, teachers of all races, backgrounds, sexes, ages have proven effective educators of urban youth. I love that so many white people care about I love that so many white people care about the plight of Black and Latino students, that they're open to working in the neighborhoods that they're in. Many of my white teachers were excellent. I get that there needs to be a diversity of experiences. Our students have to survive in the same world as everybody else. A small part of me also thinks, who better to teach urban youth the tools needed to survive in a predominantly white country than white people? But I'd be lying if I told you I wasn't disturbed by the lack of representation of Black or Latino males as teachers. Some work as principals, school aides, and staff, and others are third party vendors, education lawyers, and professors in institutions of higher education. Effective and ineffective teachers often leave the classroom in favor of these occupations. While plenty of men do great work in administration too, hold on. While plenty of men do great work in administration, too many men use it as a means of staying in education without grounding themselves in the educational practice of the classroom. Because more than 80% of the nation's teachers are women, our society also views teaching as women's work, a category that often leads to demeaning and obtuse ways of dismissing teachers' contributions. This dynamic compounds the already existing problem of society talking down to educators in our schools. Too many people don't see the need to pay teachers well or to ensure that they have proper working conditions because they see us as caretakers, not professionals. Where male-dominated professions like computer science or medicine get respect, the teaching profession still has to combat patriarchy. The fact that so many people view teaching as a second-class profession speaks volumes about our society's values. Plenty of men talk favorably about teachers, but when asked if they'd ever be teachers themselves, they respond, "I don't have the patience," and "you guys don't get paid enough." In our society, money means stature, whether we value the person who holds the position or not. It's not just coming from this generation either. My mom, who I love dearly, on occasion wonders aloud why, with all the stress and duress I endure as a teacher, I would put up with this mess when I could make 150% more as a computer programmer. There are those who have left the profession because it was really easy to get jaded about the school system and the human experience. I don't know any fellow Black or Latino male or female teachers who think that every student in their school is getting properly served by the school system. Some conclude that the system is hopeless. Others say, "We'll continue to fight." The latter are crucial. When our students see more Black or Latino sports figures populating a multi-million-dollar court or field and yet only have one Black or Latino teacher in their whole grade, or two or three in their whole school, then they're probably less inspired to take teaching seriously. It's why, for a generation, rappers like Rakim and KRS-One kept talking about teaching, because they didn't feel educated in the classroom. That's why, when we see a crowd gathered around a wild ranting man in Harlem, we should listen more closely to why his message resonates with the crowd than to the sensationalism of his rhetoric. History helps explain the lack of Black or Latino teachers, too. It was Mississippi-based teacher and National Board of Professional Teaching Standards board member Renee Moore who first told me the extraordinary story of how Black teachers in the South, especially males, were don't say systemically if it's systematically. Let's start over. History helps explain the lack of male, Black, or Latino teachers too. It was Mississippi-based teacher and National Board of Professional Teaching Standards board member Renee Moore who first told me the extraordinary story of how Black teachers in the South, especially males, were systemically dismissed or ostracized from their positions after the Brown versus Board of Education decision in anticipation of integrated public schools. Shortly thereafter, school boards removed Black educators in droves and replaced them with brand new, mostly white teachers. Nowadays, people rarely point out the racial undertones of replacing a staff who achieve their positions via traditional routes with teachers who have completed a prestigious alternative certification program that mainly solicits people from the most exclusive colleges and the upper echelons of their college classes. It is critical that we view the racially disparate impact of today's reform efforts through the lens of institutionalized racism. Whether I was aware of it or not, Jaime Escalante had stayed in my mind since I was first introduced to his story. I aspired to be just like him, but there was also more to his story. Soon after his death in 2010, we learn more details about Escalante's relationship with his school administration and how it affected his teaching, in part due to a book by Henry Gradius, the Garfield High School principal, who had seen the value in Escalante's famed accelerated math program. Yeah, from the movie. After Gradius left, the administration that replaced him did not show the same support, which undermined Escalante's ability to help his students pass the same AP exam. He was also, in a way, the victim of his own success. More students flocked to his class than he could handle, along with too many special visitors, presidents, and movie stars among them, generating jealousy from his fellow teachers in the process. The number of students taking AP Calculus at Garfield High today averages somewhere in the teens, nowhere near the level that Escalante and those who supported him achieved. Nevertheless, Escalante did amazing things during his time as the head of the math department at Garfield High School. Most importantly, whole communities felt a kinship with him. His persona carried that program and eventually inspired many others to get into teaching, including me. I can't always pinpoint what makes me or any man of color any different from other teachers of different backgrounds, but here are some things that I've learned. The Black Latino male students respond more readily to me. The girls in my class are more willing to share their experiences with me and often look to me as a role model or father figure. The people in my class may act like they hate me temporarily after I've scolded them about something, but they know I have their best interests at heart. They ask me about what it was like when I was growing up because they know my experiences mirror theirs. Some of them have considered becoming teachers because of me. Many teachers of color have seen firsthand what might happen if their children don't get a good teacher. It is clearly important for my students to see an authority figure who looks like them, understands what they're going through, challenges them, and provides a model for how to act. The year after Escalante's passing in 2011, I had the privilege of attending an event in Tarrytown, New York, held by the organization Today's Students, Tomorrow's Teachers. The program was funded by Dr. Betty Perkins to encourage more teachers of color to enter the profession through an 8-year program that provides mentorship through high school and half to full college tuition scholarships. All they have to do is get their certifications and become teachers. I wish such a group had existed when I first came into my own, but I'm excited that people like me have this opportunity now. I was invited to share a few remarks, which I titled, "It's not about salary, it's all about reality," a quote from KRS-One's classic, My Philosophy. Who gets weaker, the king or the teacher? It's not about salary, it's all about reality. Teachers teach and do the world good, kings just rule, and most are never understood. I share these lines to encourage the attendees to consider the ways educators don't merely expect to be followed, but inspire students to think for themselves. I also gave a few points by way of advice. For example, sample the best teachers from your past, but make your own story. In my first month of teaching, I told them I had this crazy idea that I would transform my students' lives and that they would change for me the way Jaime Escalante's did in Stand and Deliver. They didn't. But that first class was probably my favorite, and the one from which I learned the most. One time, we did a lesson on percentages. I wrote my lesson using the technical aspects of finding percentages. As I began to teach it and see the bored look on my students' faces, I had an idea. I wrote the word percent out and asked my kids, "Does anyone recognize a word in here?" "Cent." I said, "Oh, good. Now, has anyone ever heard of the word somewhere else, even in Spanish?" Kids jumped out of their seats. They were so excited to answer. A few kids shouted, Oh, centavo." "So what does centavo mean?" "A penny." "And how many pennies do you need to get $1 again?" 100. So when we say percent, we mean we're comparing one thing out of a possible 100. Oh! That piece of my lesson took about 10 minutes more than I had planned for. I explained. But it also made a huge difference. Teachers who can relate to their students on a cultural level can reach their students in important ways. I'm not saying people from other cultures can't help us, but every student of color could use a role model. If their role model just so happens to be the teacher in front of them, that's perfect. We have high expectations for the children sitting in front of us because we were once them. We can tell the difference between a kid not knowing how to add fractions and not knowing how to say the word fraction because many of us were once English language learners. We don't take "yo, what's up, teacher" or "hey, miss" to be a sign of illiteracy, but a sign that they want to connect with us as human beings. Our importance as teachers of color stems from this dire need for kids of all races and backgrounds to see people of color as multidimensional and intelligent people, different in culture but the same in capability and humanity. We're also the ones who can make relevant connections that keep our students engaged in the work. In order to be 21st century teachers, we're no longer going to be the MCs. Sometimes we'll be the DJs and sometimes we'll be the producers. But we'll always know the beat, the boom bap that drove you and me to teach. It's the same one that will inspire many others as well. It's not about salary, it's all about reality. The answer. My mom asks me tons of questions, yet this is the one I can't dodge, as old as I am. Why did you want to teach anyway? More accurately, my mom said, ¿Y por qué tú cogiste ese tema de informática si tú ibas a enseñar a mi hijo? Eso fue puro gasto. Footnote 8. Loosely translated, why did you pick that computer science major if you were going to teach anyway, my son? That was a pure waste. Or something like that. Dominican moms can be so reassuring. In my household, education was a binary code. Either you made it all the way through 12 years of school, leading directly into college, or you failed at life. Our relatives throughout New York sold drugs, drove livery cabs, or owned bodegas, locking them into their respective neighborhoods for as long as the job demanded. Livery cabs. Children on the block dreamt of being the next Jordan at a time when a guy shot another guy a few blocks from my school for his pair of Jordans. Or they sought to model themselves after Tupac and Biggie, instant success stories until Mr. Shakur and Mr. Wallace were shot at the tender ages of 25 and 24, respectively. They also loved the movie Scarface, but never mentioned his fatal shooting at the hands of an unnamed assailant. Whose world is this? It's true that I had once set out to be a computer programmer. I'd gotten my hands on a fair amount of technology growing up in the late 80s and early 90s. I had seen video games evolve from a black screen featuring a pixel moving from left to right to little cartoon plumbers flying across three-dimensional kaleidoscopic landscapes. My school's computer science labs came equipped with Apple models. Windows-based personal computers became cheaper options for people in poverty. I'd watch CNET's Daily Show with John C. Dvorak on the Sci-Fi Channel as religiously as I watched the first animated X-Men series on Fox. By the time I was 16, my mind was fixed on the idea that I would be a computer programmer. Nothing would stop me. Not that people tried. In fact, most of my friends and loved ones thought the sky was the limit for me. My immediate family had envisioned me becoming a doctor, a lawyer, or any profession that would push me and us into the upper middle class. I didn't have role models to follow or an official mentor to tell me to follow my computer programming dream. I didn't know about the lack of Black or Latino computer scientists, nor did I think to investigate. The teachers who put a computer in front of me all had different upbringings, including a Jewish lady in my elementary school, a Puerto Rican brother at my local boys club on the corner of Pitt and Houston Streets. Footnote 9. It also became the Boys and Girls Club in the early 2000s, but was eventually sold off to Common Ground, a nonprofit housing and community development organization. An Italian lady who taught me the fine details of typing in Microsoft Word my junior year of high school, and a black man with a festive bow tie in high school. But no one was in a position to help me understand the prerequisites. As long as I repeated computer science to myself, I figured everything would work itself out. I applied to Syracuse University, fully intending to graduate with a degree in computer science. Its financial aid program was amazing, the school environment captured me, and my first impression of the staff was positive. But during my first programming class, my teacher bored me so much that I filled my notebook half with notes and half with doodles. I jotted messages in C and Java next to fanciful pattern boxes and depictions of people I knew. I probably learned more from the doodles than the notes. My professor taught with an overhead projector, and the darkness of the room made me want to nap. My math classes didn't go much better. I got lost in the 100-to-1 student-to-teacher ratio, and my eyes glazed over, regardless of whether I sat in the back or the middle of the dimly lit auditorium. I struggled with a C average in those classes, the whole time thinking, I can teach this better, much better. I usually took a nap shortly after that thought. Outside of class, the endless nights in the computer lab staring at brackets, commas, and error messages felt like a kick between the eyes. I must have consumed 70 bags of peanut M&Ms over the course of the semester, trying to sort through problems that took the average programmer 5 minutes. My roommate, Richard Duck, also a fellow Black computer science candidate, said to me, "Jose, our lives could end up looking like Office Space." He laughed. I shrugged because I'd never seen this movie. He made me watch it. Whoa. From then on, I stared at my coding partners thinking, are we going to end up throwing a printer out of the office and beating it up with bats, wondering where our lives went wrong? Will I ever get my stapler back? Should I even lend it out to begin with? My dissatisfaction with my major only increased when I got involved in extracurricular activities and found them more fulfilling than my coursework. It was my first real introduction to cultural organizations, courtesy of a few young ladies in La Lucha, Latino undergraduates creating history in America. As small as their meetings were, just 10 to 15 people, they fed me a history I had never been motivated to look for myself. Names like Cesar Chavez and Ernesto Che Guevara resonated for reasons I couldn't fully understand. Outside of Martin Luther King Jr. and Rosa Parks, I didn't know much about my own history. Until that point, even the most well-intentioned adults had never introduced me to these resources, which would have done so much for my self-knowledge. This had much to do with where I grew up. Besides reading books like Achebe's Things Fall Apart and Roll of Thunder, Hear My Cry by Mildred Taylor, I don't remember having access to the same cultural education as my colleagues from middle-class Black families. This was not the failing of my few Black and Latino teachers as much as of the curriculum that we were taught. From kindergarten through high school, our schooling was designed to cover a normative set of educational standards and narratives that did not allow much room to deviate to teaching my own culture or history. Joining the Student African American Society had a similar effect on me. Older students in the group mentored me and showed me what it meant to be an activist. The group invited speakers like Bobby Seale, Amiri Baraka, and Angela Davis, who inspired and solidified a desire in me to adopt a more radical, bandana-wearing persona. Poet Sonia Sanchez once wrote in my old notepad, "Write new words," encouraging the younger generation to stop trying to be the next MLK, the next Malcolm, the next Rosa, and be the first of their own kind. She also challenged us to stop cursing for a month. I was much better at the first suggestion. I discussed the digital divide with the local chapter of the National Society of Black Engineers and the overt racism of the local Denny's with Asian students in America. This gave me a language for how to discuss my own ongoing experiences, something my computer science curriculum just couldn't do. I dug up the histories of the student organizations along with the writing of Malcolm X, Howard Zinn, Dolores Huerta, and Carter G. Woodson. I studied them during my off hours, quietly building up my self-esteem and sense of empowerment as a potential leader. By the time I became La Lucha's education chair, I was ready to get into those meetings and kick some butt. I taught workshops on Cesar Chavez, mentored students who approached me, and familiarized myself with the administrators. While computer science was my academic major, Black and Latino cultural studies became my life's focus. I was determined to return to my community and represent. In my senior year, La Lucha and the Office of Multicultural Affairs brought Edward Jones almost himself to campus. He was every bit the charismatic person we expected based on his performance as Jaime Escalante in Stand and Deliver, the very image of the teacher I wanted to emulate. Escalante had decided to move up, read out, to another school in favor of more privileged students. He kept pushing his program for the underprivileged, the vagabundos, the ones society didn't see as calculus students. Olmos started his lecture with the statement, "Acting is the art of being." That was the moment I realized that everything I wanted to be could only emerge through the things that I did and didn't do. Olmos had suddenly planted a fork in the middle of the road ahead of me. I could continue struggling with programming, maybe design video games or manage a computer project, start off with a $60,000 salary, and look at code all day. Or I could become a teacher. In New York, the latter would mean a starting salary of $40,000, 90 clients off the bat, substandard working conditions, and a chance to pay back all the good fortune I had received from my 17 years of schooling. I chose teaching. I did stick with my computer science major and graduated with a Bachelor of Science in 2004. I told everyone that I would fall back on teaching in case I couldn't find my dream job, even as I began to consider trading in my new mortarboard for a chalkboard.